Great to be back with you all. I see some familiar faces, friendly faces. That's always good. This is a tough topic. It's a tough year, tough time. And what I'd like to do today is kind of meander through some materials that I've given you. We won't get to cover everything, but I think these are very helpful, very factually based, and help all of us understand some of the issues that are at stake with the budget, both not only about programs, that's in some ways the easy part, but more on the revenue side and how we try to have the kind of support for the budget that we want and the kinds of services that we want and need in order to have the kind of community, the kind of society that we want. So my plan is to do a little bit of a tour through the budget and also through some of this revenue material. Talk a little bit about the coalition that Bill mentioned that's new now, One Ohio Now, that's trying to make a contribution to this. And I've given you in a separate handout a little bit of information about that group, its principles and its approach to trying to have what we call a balanced approach to the budget. But let me start where Bill kind of pitched it off, and that is we've got this $8 billion hole in the budget, meaning what we need in order to kind of keep things moving forward. In actuality, what's really important, and this is, by the way, all my view. I'm from Legal Aid. Legal Aid generally supports me in this work and all this, but this is the way that I put these things together. So if you have questions or comments, please feel free to raise them. In my view, we have two deficits. The first one is what I call the recession deficit. That's the deficit that has come about because of the very difficult economic circumstances we've been in the last 2+ years. And that quantitatively is roughly in the order of magnitude of $4 billion in Ohio, or $2 billion a year. Now, when we use these numbers, let me make clear, we do a biennial budget or a 2-year budget in Ohio. So if I say we've got an $8 billion deficit, that means $4 billion a year for 2 years. Okay, so we're clear about that. So the first part of this deficit is that which is, you would expect, having gone through the kind of recession that we've gone through and frankly are still in the process of recovering from, that there would be a shortage there. And that shows up in several ways. I'll get to that in a minute. That can be sort of complicated to understand. But the other really important piece to understand about this is that the second deficit is what we call a structural deficit. And that is a deficit that's simply built into our tax structure. And the way that came about, in 2005, the General Assembly passed House Bill 66. House Bill 66 was a quote-unquote tax reform bill. And what it did was basically two things, trying to simplify. One was redistribute the tax burden in a variety of ways by changing a lot of taxes. And secondly, in the aggregate, when they got done, it was not revenue neutral. In other words, they didn't start off by saying we got to raise $25 billion a year and then end up having raised $25 billion a year just in a different way. What they did was decrease the take by over $2 billion a year. So in other words, they just, without necessarily reference to any particular item or items, they just reduced the tax take by $2 billion a year. So what that does, and this is, one need not be a rocket scientist or an economist to do the simple math here. What this does is leave us, it's like in your household budget, you need, $10,000, and you somehow change your revenue and you have $9,000. Your expenses haven't changed. Nothing's gone down or gone away, but there you are, you're short. Well, that's what Ohio did. Ohio was not alone in this, by the way. Any number of states did this kind of stuff, but it leaves us short. So we have this structural deficit, and that's a big part of the problem. Because unless and until we make up for that, it's kind of like saying, this is, it's the way I look at it. I mean, it's like, take my example, $10,000, we cut 1,000. Then we say to that family, well, you're overspending. Well, wait a minute. What do you mean we're overspending? We're paying our mortgage, we're buying food, we're paying the insurance, and so forth and so on. They haven't changed their expenses at all. But because the revenue isn't there to support it, they've got a problem. But I think it's important to understand here that, and people with different philosophical points of view may look at this very differently, but because I'm sure some people felt like government was overspending. Some people always feel like government's overspending, no matter how much it's spent. That's just their point of view about government. They don't like it, they wish it would go away, and so if they spend any money, they're overspending. But that aside, what I'm trying to get out factually is that whatever you think about it, we're $4 billion short because they changed the rules and not because somebody went out on a spending spree. So, all of that said, how do we approach this? Well, Governor Kasich came in, elections have consequences. I mean, people, voted for the governor, they voted for change in the General Assembly, and so we now have a pretty substantial majority of people up there who feel like the way to deal with this is cut. Cut a lot, cut deeply, but don't go get any more revenue. So there's a strong kind of, amongst a lot of people, this notion of no new taxes, which means, it's a pretty broad meaning of that. No restoration of old taxes to get back in balance. No correction to what are tax loopholes that are there that people may feel like, well, are they really necessary, particularly in a hard time like this? But the mantra is no new taxes. We're going to do this with cuts. And last week, if you missed it, the House Republican caucus and the House of Representatives up there issued a release saying no taxes. There had been rumors that they might be looking at some of the loopholes, for example, so-called tax expenditures, taxes you don't collect. We'll look at some information about these in a few minutes. But they made it pretty clear they're not going to. So there's no taxes in House Bill 153, which is the administration's budget. It is hard to interpret some of the movements of money because one of the things that's going on is during the depths of the recession, the federal government provided money through the ARA legislation, the stimulus dollars that helped states maintain their normal business, somewhat normally. And that kept a lot of people, police officers, fire people, teachers, people who are pretty critical to our ongoing life, employed. And so that money goes away when the federal stimulus legislation expired and had to be made up by state dollars, or not. So if it's not made up, then things are cut. And so what we're facing here, and I want to invite you to look with me now at the first page of this handout, because this is a pretty good set of materials that Policy Matters, which is sort of a think tank here in Ohio, that looks at this stuff in great depth, has put together. And I think their material is very good. I think it's very objective. And so we can kind of use this front page here as a list of the kinds of things that are happening. Very, very deep cuts. For example, $2.3 billion from K-12 education over the biennium. So that's, more than a fourth of that total deficit right there. $500 million, I should say, from higher ed. Some of these are smaller, $4 million from our opportunity grants. Some of these you have to think about, wait, what are we cutting here? How important is this? For example, we're hurting education. You take that much money out of education, you're increasing class sizes, you're laying people off with very major impacts. Kinship Permanency Program. I wish there was time to tell you about all these programs in some detail. This is a program, $5 million, not a budget buster, but what it did was help to support parents who, or not parents, but family members who take in kids who might otherwise have to go into foster care. Because all of the data show that this is a better way to do it. They do better if they're in an extended family setting. These relatives are not always able to take them in. I mean, there's expense associated with that, so they could get some support from this program. and it's gone. And you go down here, programs for special needs kids, federally qualified health centers. Most people who know anything about them understand that they are a huge part of our healthcare safety net out there for people with no insurance, for people on Medicaid, or frankly, increasingly people with health insurance, but people who can't find a provider and who are required and or prefer to go to these centers because they provide better and more coordinated care. In the area of seniors, you've heard a lot about the emphasis on nursing homes, the counter-emphasis on home-based care. Home-based care has been growing. There's been a lot of pressure to grow it more, that a lot of more people would prefer to be in a home-based setting or home and community-based setting than in nursing homes. And nursing homes take a pretty significant whack in this budget. I will say that, and I'll come to some specifics about that in a minute, but at the same time, rather than expanding funding for the home-based alternative, which costs about 25% as much as the nursing home, so it's not only more popular, but it's far more cost-effective. It's cheaper, but it's getting cut anyway. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So these are the kinds of things that are being cut. Other major impacts, they set these up as the seizure of resources, putting that kind of characterization aside. Local government takes a very, very significant cut here in terms of state funding to local government. So what that does, in a variety of different ways, I should say, but what that does is put a lot of pressure on local governments, whether school districts or local government themselves, counties and municipalities, townships, to have to raise taxes. It's a shift from state responsibility to local. And Ohio is a very high locally taxed state. If you take a look back with me,